Hello gamers! By the time you're watching this, I've probably picked up Viper, leveled it to 90, and then taken it through the entire MSQ. You should probably be terrified of me, but not only for that reason. Because I am doing a very smart thing and making the third video ever about FF14 on this channel, something regarding healer design in the current expansion. I'm even going to be doing such things as critiquing it and offering very easy ways it could be made better, so please begin praying for the comment section now in the event this video leaves its target audience. As this is a gameplay video, I will not be directly discussing any story spoilers. The footage playing while I talk is basically whatever I was able to record myself queuing into as healer on Dynamis the day before servers went down for maintenance, which unfortunately consists of the final dungeon of 6.0, the 6.4 trial, and the 6.5 dungeon. So, you're looking at Hawk Manor right now, basically because the time I queued on White Mage was the only time I actually popped something from ARR, which is kind of crazy given the data center I was on. But anyway, if you don't want to see that spoilery Endwalker and post-Endwalker stuff, just tab the video out. I'm not going to be directly talking about the story. Or if you're super sensitive to that, come back once you're caught up to everything before Dawntrail. I'm going to skip over the reasons people are unhappy with current healer design and have been for several years now because I think they've been said enough by people who are much better at playing healers at a high level than me. I got savage clears on like every DPS role and tank. I have cleared an extreme like 3 times with a healer and that's about it, but I know the game more than enough in general to know that healer design has been circling the drain for a while now. You don't need to be an ultimate raider on the roll to tell something's up when it's this bad. That being said, while healers not being pushed in Savage and Ultimate because their kits just have too many free heals is one issue, a different issue that exists for a much larger portion of the player base is that healers are also extremely boring to play in virtually all casual content in the game. Unlike higher end content, this isn't just an issue of having a ridiculously good healing kit that goes unused. It's also an issue of normal content being way too easy. Item level scaling isn't great for a lot of the game. Normal mode encounters themselves have gotten simpler and easier with less possible fail states since Stormblood. Tanks have a lot of self-sustain right now. And, well, outgoing damage, even from avoidable mechanics that you need to screw up to get hit by, is so negligible that you will rarely need to cast a GCD heal throughout an entire run of a dungeon past level 60. This of course means that basically every GCD you press through the entire run of whatever content you're doing is one of 3 buttons that exist in functionally identical forms on all healers, which is not going to be fun for anyone, and is a serious problem for people who like playing healers but don't want to do high-end content or don't feel they're ready for it yet. This, when combined with the lack of a field operation in Endwalker and the oversimplification of both normal and alliance raids to things that are literally no harder than MSQ content anymore, means that there is zero content in the game for a casual healer enjoyer to actually enjoy playing their class. So, how do you fix all this stuff? Well, you've seen from the title that I'm not going to be talking about the completely reworking healer DPS and healing kits to make the role more fun to play angle, because I don't know healers well enough to properly spitball on ways to improve that. Instead, I have an idea for a very small tweak that can be made to healers that will hopefully allow the design space for casual content to be opened up and allow it to be remotely engaging again. Of the responses Yoshi P has had when asked why casual content is so easy and only getting easier, the most valid thing he's ever said is that especially in dungeons, difficulty can place additional stress on the healer because there are only 2 DPS that can res if they die, and if that one individual person or 2 individual people in a trial or raid go down, it's very likely you've led to a full party wipe. In my opinion, this is the only valid response he's ever had to such criticism. Everything else has blatantly been an excuse to avoid either A, putting in work to improve job or encounter design, which thankfully it seems like the latter is happening at some point in Dawntrail's patches, or B, implement basic competency checks in required content in the 4th and later expansions of the game, because people will complain if they're expected to know how to pull their weight in a cooperative multiplayer game that they've been playing for hundreds of hours now. Not only should Hall of the Novice be completely revamped to reflect current gameplay and required, but there should be an equivalent at the beginning of every expansion that is an unskippable solo duty with difficulty that cannot be reduced, that requires you to play whatever role you're on correctly at a higher level of competency as the levels increase before you're allowed to go on with the story. That is a different story though. I'm trying to think of a small change that can be made to healers so that a situation in casual content where all healers go down is still recoverable, so said content can be more difficult without making a first-time healer feel bad for wiping the party on their own if they happen to die because of a mechanic they've never seen before. Extra points if you can think of something that doesn't require the complete overhaul of healer design because, well, I want to think of something that could be implemented before 8.0 when they said they're going to look at job uniqueness again. I think that by far the easiest and simplest way to go about this is to implement something that not only other MMOs, but also plenty of previous Final Fantasy games going all the way back to FF6 on the Super Nintendo have included. Re-raise. The ability for healers to apply a status to allies that will automatically resurrect them when they are killed. Obviously, for the purposes I want such an ability to serve here, we do have to tweak it. Make it so that a healer can only apply it to themselves, and it will only trigger once per encounter, so you can't just spam it on everyone and chain res your way through mechanics even easier than a red mage can. There still need to be punishments for death, but healers should have a small safety cushion because they are the only people in any random party guaranteed to be able to bring anyone else back. Versions of this even already exist in 14, so we know it's not impossible from a programming standpoint. There's a deep dungeon version, there's an exploratory content version that only gives you a chance of being resurrected, and there's even a few solo duty versions that I don't think I'm allowed to talk about in a video that's not talking about spoilers. So how exactly do you implement this? Well, just make a new healer role action. Re-raise, instacast GCD only usable outside of combat that costs say 800 MP. Using it gives you the re-raise status where the next time you die you will be automatically resurrected with the same weakness, transcendence, lack of MP, and small amount of HP as if you've been resurrected by any raise spell from any job. Have it be learned, say, level 36, so right after you get your job stone if you're White Mage or Scholar, and in the very weird long gap in roll actions between Lucid at 24 and Surecast at 44 that healers get, and hey, there you go! I literally just fixed normal content by adding one skill. But is that completely satisfying, though? I don't think so. Why would we make a 7th role action for healers when we can instead give each healer a unique and flavorful re-raise and make them act as a counterpart to tank invulns? These of course would have to function a bit differently than the role action re-raise I just described. They'd have to be OGCDs on long cooldowns that can only be executed while you are KO'd and do not have an active res status from a regular res spell. This might have the unintentional advantage of being easier to code around just being able to re-raise your way through a wipe, because you would need to be dead and on the ground to activate this while re-raise might kick in automatically, and it might be hard knowing how the game works to program an exception to re-raise so that it doesn't go off if nobody else is alive when you die. It also is a little bit of a paradigm shift in that, obviously with the role action re-raise, you can re-up that between every encounter in something like a dungeon, but you would only get the re-raise exactly once in harder single target content like Savage or Ultimate, unless they make it work sort of like Reaper's Soulso, for example, where it does have a long cast time in combat that you'd only want to use during downtime. For balance's sake, I do think that these healer ultimates might need to have a bit of a longer cooldown than some of the tank ones, because if we gave, say, Scholar one with a 240 second cooldown mirroring Holmgang, it would be like 6 self-reses in a fight as long as top, which, I mean, that might be a little busted. So I think maybe it should be tweaked so that in like an 8 to 10 minute extreme or early Savage fight, you get to use it twice at most, and probably even only once per phase in a 4th floor Savage with a door boss. And like, I'd say 3 self-reses per ultimate is about the upper limit for what you should probably be allowed to do in an ultimate. And honestly, if you're dying 3 times in different ways, at least one of those deaths is probably going to cause a wipe, so I'm not too concerned about this trivializing ultimates at all. And besides, this exists to facilitate better casual content, and that stuff doesn't have it in Rage. I have had normal mode trials where a lot of people were dying a lot of times last upwards of 20 minutes, so being able to not wipe in one of those and take another 20 minutes on another pull because you were able to res yourself 3 or 4 times, I think is worth maybe making ultimates a little easier in a way where they would just have to design future ultimates around it and potentially get better fight design out of it too. Another potential concern, I guess, is that, okay, tanks have a cool, flavorful ultimate cooldown. We're now giving healers ones. What about DPS? Are DPS being left out? Honestly, I don't think they should ever get them, purely because I don't know how this would be implemented in a reasonable way for them. Obviously, you can't have a version of FF11's signature 2-hour cooldowns because that is a skill you press once in your opener and then never again for the rest of the encounter, which doesn't really seem like a cool, flavorful ultimate skill. It's just another more DPS button you use exactly once. And, well, if you give them a support skill along those lines, then, well, that's not very flavorful for your DPS. And besides, with a single-digit number of exceptions in the 10-year-old plus game, if you're playing optimally, the only role who should ever touch the limit break button in a duty is DPS, so I think they should have that, and it is okay to give more cool, interesting, and flavorful tools to tanks and healers because less people play them anyway, and anything like that is more incentive for someone to make the jump from DPS to support if they were unsure about it before. With that lengthy preamble that is going to be the majority of the length of the video out of the way, what are my ideas for these self-res ultimate skills for all 4 healers currently in the game? Keep in mind, these do need to be balanced around the fact that in 4-person content, you might have a summoner or red mage able to res you, and in 8-person content, you will have another healer who is able to res you. So they have to be balanced around the fact that they exist to take some stress off of healers in casual content, and should be flavorful to that healer's identity and a bit better than just getting regularly rezzed, but also should still have enough drawbacks where they don't create any significant new ways to cheese mechanics by sacking yourself that wouldn't have already been possible with either a res mage or second healer. Ultimately, this boils down to just, you still get the weakness debuff if you res yourself, because losing DPS is the worst punishment you could get in this game, but some of the things I think of might not be particularly balanced and might require additional drawbacks. Case in point to this is White Mage. While White Mage's kind of place among the healers is most similar to Warriors among the tanks in that they're both the simplest and easiest to understand members of their role, and as such the best recommendation for a DPS player wanting to try out support for the first time, and the only 2 jobs in the game with access to Benediction, I think taking a cue from Paladin and giving White Mage the simplest self-res is the best call here. I already brought up Benediction, so why don't we just give White Mage an automatic self-Benediction on a much longer cooldown? Instead of resing with 20% of your HP, you just res with all of it. The job doesn't even need to get any MP bonus from this res because with 2 charges of Thin Air and Lucid being on a 60-second cooldown, you're always going to be either at or very close to getting a lot of MP back. As for naming this ability, I think there are 4 options here. The first is obviously the same as before, Re-Raise. Barring roll actions, White Mage is the only healer to get a significant amount of classic Final Fantasy spells in their toolkit, so if we're not making this skill into a roll action, the only job that makes sense to have it called Re-Raise is White Mage. This works 100% perfectly fine as is, but does have one small flavor fail, in that, as I mentioned before, Re-Raise, both in classic games and in 14, is a buff applied to the recipient of the skill that activates and goes away after they die, while this is an activated ability that's used while you're already dead, so it does kind of clash both with the classic and already in 14 depictions of how re-raising works. The second option is Arise. Arise is another classic Final Fantasy white magic spell that is basically just an upgraded version of Raise that 14 white mages already have. Raise is a partial HP res, Arise is a full HP res. The only difference between this and the classic Arise is that it only works on yourself after you're already dead. So same type of flavor fail as with Re-Raise, except it isn't already a type of ability that exists in the game, so it's a bit more okay to say this is just how this ability works in 14. The third option is probably the most boring, and that is Auto Benediction, because it would be automatically using Benediction on yourself after you're dead. And auto could mean automatic or on yourself. The biggest issue here is that it might confuse English speakers who think it's automatic when you do have to activate the skill to use it, and also giving it a name that's a Greek pun might kind of encroach on Sage's naming territory of everything being Greek. The fourth option is simply a combination of probably just arise and re-raise, like re-arise or re-rise or something along those lines. I think that is the most likely option purely because not directly giving White Mage something named after the classic re-raise and arise spells technically opens up future design space for White Mage getting them in the future as just a regular cooldown. If any healer would end up getting a better raise on a long cooldown in the future, it would be White Mage, and if they got any enhanced raise, it would probably just be the classic Arise. Next up is Scholar, and while their original job identity of being a tactician is basically being completely removed in favor of some abilities that look technological and cybery like Sage, and some abilities that just look like White Mage abilities, their current gameplay identity seems to be being very powerful, having expedient, having a bunch of capstone skills that have zero synergy with each other and have anti-synergy more than anything, and being kind of clunky and confusing. I don't know if I'll be able to capture all of those things in one made-up skill, but I'm going to try, and I'm going to try to have it fit alongside Scholar's original intended job identity, because I think that's way more interesting than just stealing the look of other jobs. I think I came up with something pretty unnecessarily complicated, so I'm very happy with myself. This ability is very conditional, as Scholar has a bunch of different states depending on their fairy and their abilities that they can be in, so each potential option gives you a different benefit. That is, unless you don't have a fairy out at all. And I'm not talking about Dissipation. Dissipation will be a different story. If you have no fairy summoned and have not dissipated it away, you just get a normal res with zero benefits. This is the only one of these abilities that has technically a downside, but if you don't have your fairy out, it's kinda on you. You deserve burning your ultimate cooldown on basically nothing. As for all of the other states, they might need to slightly tweak how Scholar works, just so the game remembers what state you were in when you die, because obviously buffs like Dissipation and Seraphism will go away, and your fairy dies when you do. The most elegant option is simply to have a buff recorded on you when you die that remembers what state you were in, say one for fairy, one for seraph, one for Dissipation, and one for Seraphism that stacks with the fairy or seraph ones. But knowing how 14 works, that might be impossible to code, so instead they probably have to do something where fairy or seraph stops moving or acting, but doesn't actually disappear until you accept a res or press your res skill, and then Seraphism and Dissipation buffs just turn into buffs with 60-second durations that don't do anything, and those also get consumed by using your res skill. Obviously, the other signpost unique buffs thing is a better idea, but I don't trust the game to be able to accommodate something like that. Anyway, for having just regular Eos or Selene out when you use your res ability, you will res not just with your 20% HP, but also a Galvanized shield, with potency equal to that of your Adloquium's shield, without any death debuffs. Additionally, you come back with 1 Ether Flow and 600 MP. If Seraph was out, on the other hand, you res with 20% HP, the same Galvanized shield, and a Catalyzed shield, as if you used a crit low on yourself without the base HP restoration, 2 Ether Flow and 1200 MP. The other healers don't quite have the MP economy that White Mage does, so I think it is okay for these abilities to give them some MP back, and because Ether Flow normally gives you 2000 MP, I figured rounding down a little bit to 600 per would be fair. Do also keep in mind, you're getting your regular Galvanize and Catalyze shields, which means you are actually able to deployment tactics on yourself in order to spread your own res shield out, which is just kind of another small bit of recovery you can have. I do think it's kind of interesting how this ability basically gives you the option to slightly choose what kind of additional res bonuses you're going to get if you know you're going to die a little bit ahead of time, and could potentially lead into a bit more quick thinking to save a pull even in harder content, so you burn a cooldown just to get yourself in a better position after you res, and now your pre-planned spreadsheet is out of whack, so you have to use quick thinking and good tactics in order to keep the party alive and maneuver yourself into a place where you can get your cooldowns lined up again, because no good plan survives contact with the enemy. Next is Dissipation, and I'm a little bit conflicted here. Obviously, the flavor of this skill is that when you die, you're eating your fairy to come back to life in a slightly more advantageous position. And obviously, you can resummon your fairy immediately after coming back, so it's not like some big unethical thing or anything. It's the same as using Dissipation in the first place. But then, what unique thing does it give you for having Dissipation out? Obviously, it should give you a better bonus than having no fairy, but it can't just give you a shield or something, because those are the things the fairies do. Because Dissipation just increases your raw healing potency, the only thing I can really think of is that it will give you 1 ether flow, 600 MP, and an additional amount of HP as if you had cast Physic on yourself, even increasing in potency as Physic does during the Endwalker levels. I'm not perfectly happy with this, there's probably a more flavorful thing to do here, but I still think it does work. I know it doesn't count as a state of being for Scholar, but Expedient is a very funny skill, so I think that if you died while you had Expedient acted, you just get the run speed bonus when you come back. For literally zero reason, you have 10 seconds of sprint, just kind of because I think it's funny. Lastly though is the new Dawntrail skill, Seraphism. This is an enhanced state for the Scholar themselves, somewhat similar to Dissipation, though it does not eat your fairy, that gives you a regen and massively buffs Adlo and Succor. Unfortunately, I can't really just say this gives you a third shield, because at that point it's probably redundant. You would probably be shielded for more than your max HP, and also, even though Seraphism changes Adlo and Succor to new skills, the shield buffs they give are still Galvanize and Catalyze, so that wouldn't really work, and since eating Seraph doesn't give you the Consolation Shield, it would be weird for Seraphism to give you the Consolation Shield. Instead, in addition to whatever fairy or dissipation bonuses you get, you also gain the same regen you would have if you activated Seraphism. Pretty simple and clean, but I think it makes sense for what the ability is. As for the name of this skill, there are really two different camps you can go in. The first is playing on the flavor of eating your fairy to come back to life, and the second is playing on the tactical angle, which is talking about, oh, how cool of a tactics move this is, and you could even sort of flavor it as making a gambit and fooling the enemy by playing dead, even if that's obviously not why you would ever use that in actual gameplay. In the first camp, the coolest sounding option is absolutely Reincarnate. Though if you want to bring back a removed Scholar ability in name only, Fey Covenant would also probably work there. On the other hand, Turn Tables is the best way I can think of, where turning the tables on the enemy and turning things around by removing your fairy from play and restoring yourself to the game board. And as far as removed Scholar skills go, I guess Rouse would also work there, even if you're only rousing yourself. Obviously, I think Reincarnate is the best option here. It hasn't really been used in a Final Fantasy game before, but since when has that stopped this iteration of Scholar? Alright, next is Astrologian time, and honestly, after White Mage, this was the next easiest thing to think of. Even though the developers have definitely forgotten about this by now, Astro is not just a tarot card mage. It is the 14 equivalent of the classic Final Fantasy job Time Mage, so their self-resurrection ability should definitely be time magic themed. Obviously, we go with the coolest possible time magic self-resurrection concept, which is, post-mortem, your magic kicks in one last time and brings you back to a previous state in time in which you were still alive, but this puts a massive strain on your body, so you do still suffer the weakness debuff. This would obviously need a lot of fine-tuning to make it work properly, and out of everything I'm going to suggest in this video is by far the hardest to program, but I think it would be really, really cool. You'd also need to make a distinction. Does it bring you back to X amount of seconds before you pressed the button to use the ability, or X amount of seconds before you died? Because if it's the former, you have to use the ability fairly soon after you die, or you'll rewind to a point when you were already dead and completely waste the activation. This makes it the second hardest of these abilities to use after Scholars, and gives you the disadvantage, specifically as Astro, of not being able to just wait the next mechanic out until it's the most smooth time to get back up when nothing else is happening. But on the flip side, this is also most likely to give you a lot of MP back immediately. I don't think it would be a good idea to reset your cooldowns to their previous state when you do this, because they've still been rolling while you were dead. It would really feel bad to do this, and then your cooldowns get a few seconds added back to them. But you're rewinding yourself. You're coming back with the amount of HP, the amount of MP, and maybe even any cards you hadn't played yet that you had at the point you were going back to. So all of that in exchange for having a much stricter window of time in which to use this ability, and probably a longer cooldown than some of the others, I think is very fair. As for naming this ability, there are a lot of very good options. Destiny Cancel sounds extremely cool, but it might be too edgy for Astro and too weird sounding for FF14, so that's probably not a good idea. Bringing back Time Dilation in name only technically works, and that would kind of sound cool as well. Rebirth would be appropriate both for this and Scholar, though I think it's more applicable there, and there are better options here for Astro. Rewind is not an existing Final Fantasy ability, but it's already a term I've used multiple times to describe this, so I think it very appropriately fits. And while there is a similar ability in mainline Final Fantasy, it is most frequently called Return, including its Japanese name, so you can't really use that in 14 when Return already has a completely different usage. It is called Reset in certain translations of FF5, but again, its Japanese name is Return, so unless they want to call it Reset in Japanese and invent a new Final Fantasy ability, I don't really know about that. For the best overall options though, I think we need to look at the Final Fantasy Tactics series take on Time Mages. In every mainline entry of the Tactics series, Time Mages have a passive ability that allows them to immediately take a turn when their HP reaches a critical value. In the original Tactics, it's called Critical:"Quick, and in Tactics A2, it's Critical:"Quicken, but in Tactics Advance, it's called Last Quicken, which, while it's kind of a different function of ability, I do think it's kinda cool sounding. The best option though, I think, is Time Mage's ultimate ability from Tactics A2, as this is called Undo. It restores the Time Mage's status to how they were at the previous turn, which fits a lot closer with the ability I'm proposing that only rewinds you a few seconds, when compared to the Time Mage Return Reset from Final Fantasy V, which goes back to the beginning of the entire battle. Lastly, we have Sage, who I think we can pretty reasonably equate with Gunbreaker, as they're the most technologically advanced jobs in their role, and both have the identity of being DPS-like, in that they both have the least boring damage rotation in their role. Even if Eucrasian Dyscrasia does not stack with Eucrasian Dosis in the released version of Dawntrail, even though it did in the Media Tour, and everybody really liked that. Learn how to design healers better, what are you doing? Digressions aside, I think we can pretty reasonably just port Super Bolide over to Sage, because they're also both gun jobs, so I kind of like the idea of them having this kind of weird kinship that goes beyond their DPS identities. Similar to how Holmgang used to be, Sage's ability is the only one that requires you to be targeting an enemy, as instead of being revived with 20% HP, Sage will get up with only 1 HP, but when they do so, they will deliver an attack only to the targeted enemy. This attack has fixed damage, which is equal to the Sage's maximum HP, and this damage is converted into a unique shield buff with potency equal exactly to the amount of damage that was just dealt, that does stack with any other shield in the game. An additional 3-stack buff that effectively gives the Sage the benefits of their own Cardia for the next 3 attacks within, say, 15 seconds. And all 3 charges of Adder Sting back. Note, they do not get any MP, and they do not get any Adder's Gall, so unless they have Lucid or Zoe off cooldown, their next GCD basically has to be some form of attack, and that will allow them to heal themselves up so they're not left at a small amount of HP whenever their shield wears off. And This shield will have a very short duration, probably also 15 seconds instead of the usual 30 seconds of other GCD shields. This means that unless they have exactly Holos off cooldown, they also have nothing that can immediately heal themselves, so they're forced to do damage to get out of this precarious situation they find themselves in, and generate resources to heal any other party members that might need it, which is all aided by the fact that they do get all 3 of their instant cast Toxicons back even after death. I think this is very appropriate for Sage, and the only issue I have here is naming this new ability, because, well, all Sage's abilities are Greek, and I know basically no Greek, so I'm just going to come up with a name in English and say that translated into Greek is the actual name of the skill. The most obvious name, I think, is Resuscitate, as Sage is also the most medicine-themed healer, and this is a resurrection ability name that just hasn't been used. Now, unfortunately, I also don't know Greek, so I'm not 100% sure if that would translate most directly into the name of a skill that Sage already has. But I do know something that it definitely doesn't, and for this, we need to go into further Final Fantasy spin-offs, as Sage is a job in Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light, and its final ability is called Good and Evil, which has the effect of summoning a holy light to damage all foes and heal all allies. This works perfectly. Obviously, the 14 version is a single target on both ends, but damaging an enemy and then using that damage to, if not heal, shield yourself, is close enough where I think that, translated into Greek, probably a more archaic form than modern Greek, would be a perfect name for this skill. The only potential issue is damage balancing, because, well, you are doing a hit to the enemy equal to your max HP immediately on getting up from being rezzed, but you're also coming back with a debuff decreasing your outgoing damage, so I think it's okay. With current stat scaling and without Epic Echo, and if you're using Epic Echo for something, how did you die in the first place? I can't really find a way in which intentionally dying, using Good and Evil, and dealing with the debuff will still result in you having done more DPS than just spamming Dosis the entire time, so I think we're in the clear here. And yeah, that's the video. Honestly, the important part about healers being given a self-res fixing casual content was described very early on, and most of the rest of it was me fan-fictioning cool new abilities that they'll probably never make. But I had a lot of fun with this, and I hope you had a lot of fun watching. If you want more 14 content, please tell me. I am primarily a Xeno channel, but I would love to branch out into other JRPGs that I like a lot, like FF14 and the Trail series, and the more people ask for other content, the more I'm going to make it, because quite frankly, this does not do as well as my Xeno content, and the more of it I make and the less people watch it, the less people get recommended future Xeno videos, so I want to make sure I have a dedicated following for non-Xeno content the more I decide to make. That being said, I will likely be streaming a lot of raiding now that Dawntrail is out and is going to have a new Savage tier and some extremes, so look forward to future streams for me if that's the kind of 14 content you'd like. Until the next 14 video, the first 14 stream, or even the next Xeno video if you're also a fan of that series, I'm Luxon, signing off.